Hi, I'm Chris Rowbottom, National Sales Manager for Drainfast. I'm here this morning to find out more about silt management on construction sites, and I'm joined by
Leela O'Day, the Technical Director at Frog Environmental. We specialise in silt control and water treatment technologies.
What I'd like to do first of all is ask what sort of regulations are there in the UK regarding silt management on construction sites?
Well, essentially, silt is a pollutant. So when silt is entrained within water, it becomes muddy water, and that reaches our rivers, our groundwaters, and it can cause huge environmental consequences. And some of those might be it could impact the way fish behave, they can't search for food. It could impact the invertebrates that live in the waterways in terms of ruining the habitat. So it has big environmental consequences. More recently, there's been other environmental consequences as well associated with flood risk. So obviously the more silt that is entering the water body that wouldn't naturally occur there is going to build up and cause the waters to overflow or block weirs or block flood defence structures. So it's really important that we keep silt as a pollutant out of our watercourses.
And who would enforce these policies?
The regulators for the policy within England is the Environment Agency. So likewise in Scotland it would be SEPA, Wales it would be Natural Resources Wales, and in Northern Ireland it would be the Northern Ireland Environment Agency. And each country has its own set of environmental regulations, and whilst there is nothing specific to silt control, there is no Silt Control Protection Act, we tend to work within the Environmental Protection Act, we work within the Environmental Permitting Regulations Act. Sometimes people are prosecuted under sort of Fisheries Act where we're trying to protect fisheries. So there's multiple different ways that pollution is managed within legislation in the UK. There's no one specific agenda here. And so when we see companies are fined or prosecuted, it might be under multiple different ones.
And those fines, are they particularly prohibitive? Do they cost companies a lot of money?
Well, when you get fined, there is obviously a huge burden when it comes to your environmental team who are going to have to work with the regulator, because at first you're going to have to look at what you're doing wrong, how you can fix it, because that is obviously always the most important thing, is to stop the pollution from happening, to improve our works and to move forward with good environmental practice in place. And the regulators will always champion that. At the same time, you might end up in a position where you're being fined. That could be a fine put in place by the regulator there and then. You might be asked just to pay a lump sum towards an environmental organisation, or to basically protect the environment on the understanding that it is possible to move forward with good environmental practice, and it's not worth them taking you to court. If you go through prosecution, there's obviously a much longer period it's going to take, and you may get a much larger fine, and the fine is going to be based on the turnover of the company, it's going to be based on the severity of the pollution event, and it's going to be based on whether they felt it was intentional or whether it was genuinely accidental.
Well, let's say I'm a small, medium-sized property developer, house builder, and I think I've got a reasonable silt management policy, but I'm not sure. What would you tell me, or would you come in and tell me to do in order to make sure that is compliant?
I would say you need to look at your risks on site. So it's very simple when you're planning your works to identify where the potential receptors are, i.e. where the local watercourses are, whether there is any risk with respect to the aquifers that might be underneath your property, and any potential pathways. So if you're working on farmers' land, there might be drains in place, there might be underground drainage that you can't see that allows water to travel off your site in a direction. So you have to understand the risk. You've got to think about your topography, your geology. You know, if you're working in sands and gravels, the risk is going to be significantly reduced because you're going to have good infiltration and you're going to have larger particle sizes. If you're working on a site that has got a lot of clay or very fine silt, then your risk is going to be much higher because the permeability of the clays are going to be restricted, so you're going to have more surface water, and the particle size is much smaller, so it's going to become entrained within the water more easily, and it's much harder to separate by gravity.
So what sort of products could you potentially offer or recommend to prevent silt from getting into the watercourse or other environmental places?
So First and foremost, you've got to think about what it is you can do to prevent the source from happening in the first place. So can you change your work methodology? Obviously that's idealistic, but you can look at phasing, you can look at not stripping all of your soil and creating bare earth in the first place if you're going to be working through phases that we often see on residential and even the large construction sites. That's going to be a really, really critical first point of call, is minimising your risk. The next thing you can start to look at doing is, if you're placing infrastructure on first, as a lot of residential developers have to, you're creating a road network, and with that you're creating a drainage network. You have to protect that drainage network, because that is, you're ultimately creating a pathway for water to travel through your site.
Yes.
So you have to protect the drains. So you're either going to block them to prevent water going into the drains altogether, but you have to
Wouldn't
also
that just
accept
push the water
is going to
else?
still move on site. So you have to understand where the water is going to move to, how you're going to control that water, and at what point you're going to release that water off your site. It's really important to understand right at the beginning of your project your discharge point, the point at which it's going to release. Some sites have very limited discharge, and so you might be limited by the volume of water you can actually let go. You might be relying on a surface water drainage system or a foul network system rather than having a nice big river where you could discharge into. So you might be limited, in which case you've got to think about building attenuation, water attenuation, so you can hold your stormwater in place on site and release it at the flow rate that has been agreed through planning, that the receptor allows you to, really, to prevent flood risk downstream. So during the temporary works, it's no different to during your permanent works. You still have to think about flood risk. You still have to think about where that water is going, and you've got to try and keep it clean and clear. If you're going to be putting your water down through your drainage network, your permanent drainage network, then how are you going to stop some of the heavy solids moving down there?
Yes.
So are you going to protect the drains themselves? What are you going to put in place to prevent those solids moving through into the drains and therefore into your attenuation feature or your SUDS feature? So you've got to think through all of these different aspects and work out what is going to be the best fit for your site. There is no one way to do it everywhere. You've got to think about the risk that you've got on site, the infrastructure you've got on site, and how you are ultimately going to manage and treat that water off site.
You've come on site, you've told us what we need to do, what potential products we might need to get. Going forward, how do we monitor that they are as effective as we need them to be?
Well, there's many ways you can monitor. You can do visual monitoring using your own employees, so you can train people up to look at it. You can do monitoring using handheld equipment, which is even better because it takes away some of that subjectivity that an individual might have. And you could employ someone to come in, so you can take in a consultant, for example, and they could come in, or maybe they could do monthly visits whilst you're doing the day-to-day monitoring. So so there's lots of ways to monitor, but ultimately you have to understand what you are looking for.
So on site, obviously it's a big construction site. There's lots of sediments, different types of pollutants. Can you go through the different types of risks that are associated with the various pollutants on site and how we deal with those?
Yeah, so basically sediment is a very large scale. So you've got your cobbles and gravels and sands at one spectrum of it, and obviously they're very large particle sizes, and they're going to be more easy to capture through gravity, so they're going to naturally settle out within a pond or within a tank-based system. But then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the fine silts and clay particles, which are sort of 0.2 microns. So they are minuscule and not visible to the naked eye. And that's when they become more entrained within the water. And we have to actually look at them as a water treatment process. So as we move down the scale from cobbles, sands, gravels, silt particles, so we can separate those from the water using physical structures. So for example, something sat within the drainage where we know they're going to be easy to capture, they're not going to move through the sort of fibre, as it were, the particle sizes are very large, so they're not going to move through the structure. So you can physically remove those from the water. And that's really, really important, because the sands and the large sediments are going to actually restrict some of your drainage. They're going to sit very heavily in the bottom of your drains and cause a significant problem in terms of water flow through your site. So it's really important to capture those at that point. However, what we find is the clays and the small silt particles will move through those features because they are so entrained within the water. They're going to get through the fibrous particles, they're going to overtop. They're just not captured within the drainage like that. So we end up having to put more treatment in place for it. So we often end up introducing a flocculant or a coagulant into the drainage system.
Okay, for someone like me, I'm not familiar with those type of products. What do they actually do?
So a flocculant is a chemical. It's environmentally safe, but it allows the negative clay particles to bind together. So instead of having billions and trillions of these tiny clay particles all entrained within the water, the flocculant comes in and creates long chains so they combine together to create a flock, and essentially they form almost like a snowflake. So they're now much larger and they're going to act in a more similar way to a sand will. So what we do is we tend to start the treatment when we're working within gravity or passive treatment processes. So we might put a gel flocculant block into a drain, following a drainage sort of bag or feature, and then the particles will form, and at the end of the drain you must have something like an attenuation pond or a settlement pond, and within that settlement pond they're going to naturally fall out of suspension, and we are trapping them there. So then we're going to have clean and clear water run off site, and all of the sediments are going to be held on site in different areas depending on the size of those particles.
How does a company like Frog Environmental minimise these risks on construction sites?
We at Frog Environmental are literally silt control specialists and water treatment specialists. So we will work with companies across the range within the UK, whether it's residential, commercial, linear construction sites, and we'll give sort of pre-construction advice. We will work with people during temporary works phase, right through to the operational phase, and the whole idea is we're trying to identify the risk and find a solution. As part of that solution, we've got a number of different products available on the market. So we've situated ourselves in quite a unique position. We're not a tank-based company, and we're not offering just a silt fence around the edge. We have very specific water treatment products, and we are trying to work with the existing infrastructure on a construction site to maximise the silt control that we can achieve without having the additional costs associated with the higher tanks and other vessels like that. So basically at Frog Environmental we come up with quite a unique treatment process to fit across a variety of sites, and whilst it's process driven, it will become site specific to individuals' requirements and risks. Part of what we want to do though is also train and upskill the industry, the construction industry, because it's such a high risk area. We want to share our knowledge, we want to pass on sort of our enjoyment really. I mean, I know a lot of people think, muddy water, how is this fun? But it is, it's a great science, and it's really interesting when you get down to the physics of how sediments work.
I'm glad you enjoy it. I find construction sites slightly different to that, but I am glad you enjoy that.
There's always a challenge to be had, and so I say we really want to share our lessons that we've learned over the last decade of working in this industry, and we're happy to do that with CPD sessions. We're happy to join you guys on site to chat about it really, or equally if you want more detailed training, we can offer a detailed training plan.
Are there any specific permits needed via the Environment Agency for construction sites?
If we're going to be discharging water, there is a regulatory position statement, RPS 261, available for dewatering excavations, and that can be used up to 3 months, providing that you are releasing clean and clear water. Part of your water is going to need treatment, or there is a risk that it is being contaminated with oils, then we need to go into a route called the bespoke environmental permitting regulations. And so if you need to have clay particles and you're going to treat them using a flocculant or a coagulant, then we need to apply for this permit in advance of releasing water from site.
And do the Environment Agency actually call on site to ensure that the permit is correct and people are abiding by the permit?
The Environment Agency will set conditions. Those conditions tend to be pH and total suspended solids, as well as visible oils. So it's really important that when a site is releasing water, that they are monitoring it themselves. So they are checking to make sure that they are operating within the consented limits. But the Environment Agency will and can come onto site to check that you're within the compliance levels. Often they're drawn in because there's been a pollution reported to them,
Yes.
and so they are following the route of the pollution, and it might be your site on that route, and they're obviously going to check your discharge.
Layla, thank you ever so much for this morning. It's been a real pleasure, and I feel now that I understand a lot more about silt management on construction sites.
Excellent. It's been a real joy to speak with you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you to Frog Environmental for providing valuable insights on silt control and management. For more details, contact Frog Environmental at 0345 057 4040. Visit their website at frogenvironmental.co.uk or find them on Facebook, YouTube and LinkedIn. For underground drainage solutions, contact Drainfast Limited at 01420 555 600. Visit drainfast.co.uk or follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, TikTok and Instagram. Thank you for watching. Check out our other videos for more content on underground drainage and don't forget to like and subscribe.